Fantasy. Fantasy, fantasy, fantasy. Fantasy, fantasy, fantasy. I've been watching a lot of fantasy this last couple of years, and chances are you have been too. And who could blame us? These last few eventful years have left people searching for a sense of escapism in its purest form. Stories not just about different people, but set in different worlds that follow different rules. Fantasy is a fickle genre though. Amongst introducing the story, characters and themes, you also need to acclimate your audience to a new setting with its own traditions, history, mythos and mechanics, leaving a broad spectrum of things that can go very badly wrong. At the end of 2021, we were treated to two shows at the opposite ends of the spectrum. Arcane, acclaimed as one of last year's best new series, animated or otherwise, and High Guardian Spice, which would have been considered the worst were it not for X-Arm.
Oh god, oh man, oh god, oh man, oh god, oh man, oh god!
And I'm not here to trash High Guardian Spice, plenty already have. This video isn't about why High Guardian Spice is shit and you shouldn't watch it. I mean, it definitely is and you definitely shouldn't, but let me be clear, this show is a gift. The only way I can find to describe my appreciation for High Guardian Spice is, you know how every few years a news story makes the rounds about someone finding a two-headed turtle or a two-headed snake or a two-headed fish, and you look at the pictures and you understand that yes, it's likely in constant pain, and yes, it probably won't last for very long, but there's still some primal fascination in knowing that it exists at all. That an anomaly so absurdly broken at a fundamental genetic level is real, and that you get to witness it. Makes you thankful for it in some way, and so for that reason, I can't be mad at High Guardian Spice for being a shit show any more than I can be mad at this thing for being a shit fish. Because that is what High Guardian Spice is. It is the shit two-headed fish of Western animation. My appreciation for Arcane is much more simple. It's simply a good show. And the point of this video is to compare two examples of fantasy series, one good and one bad, to examine where one succeeds and the other fails, and what lessons can be learned from that for someone who either wants to break these stories down or maybe even create one of their own, so that we can see more of this and less this. Oh, and spoiler warning. Let's deal with the obvious stuff first. Television is an audio-visual format. Sound and vision are going to have significant impacts on our ability to enjoy a show, and it's not exactly the hottest take to suggest that Arcane both looks and sounds a lot better than High Guardian Spice. It's kind of an unfair comparison though. Arcane clearly had a much bigger budget than Spice, and you can see that in literally every frame of both shows. And there's a fairly popular notion positing that good writing can make up for bad animation. But the truth is that when people say writing, what they usually mean is storytelling. And storytelling and animation are a little bit more difficult to separate. Take Arcane's fight between Jinx and Echo, one of that show's most memorable moments. Without the use of words, Arcane communicates the tragedy of those characters' lost innocence. How the social inequality at the heart of the story turned these two childhood friends into angry, bitter opponents, so jaded and desensitized to the indifferent cruelty of their surroundings that they now wouldn't think twice about killing each other. There's not any writing in this scene from a dialogue sense. There probably wasn't a lot written detailing this fight in the script, but there's an abundance of storytelling told through the audio-visual language of Arcane's directing, storyboarding, shot composition, colouring, editing, music, sound design, and of course, its animation. Arcane says so much with so little because it has the confidence to let the visuals and music say what's needed. Now, humour me, imagine that you're a writer who'd like to do the same sort of thing with your series, which is called High Guardian Spice. Would you have any confidence in the presentation of your show to carry the storytelling effectively when it looks like this? Or would you resort to channeling the details of your story through dialogue and exposition? Make up your mind after seeing this scene from Spice's first episode, when the show attempts to establish how magical its setting is through visual storytelling, and this is how it looks. A 4-minute scene of gerbils fucking that has absolutely no bearing on the rest of the series, slap bang in the middle of your first episode. Why exactly they chose irrelevant rodent sex to convey the whimsy of Lingarth, I can't say. But the point is that the animation department was clearly so underpaid that it probably would have looked like this regardless of what they asked for. And I'm not trying to exonerate Spice's writing, there's still plenty of amateurishly baffling decisions that can't be excused just by the budget issues, but it should be understood that the show's visuals are more than just surface level. Arcane's animation and aesthetic strengths do more than just make the series look pretty. It allows it to engage with its audience in different methods of storytelling that simply aren't accessible to a show like High Guardian Spice, where the writing is being asked to carry the story and messages alone and suffers drastically as a result. Which is why you get scenes that are so stuffed with dialogue that characters are all but talking over each other.
Are you awake?
Technically.
Absolutely.
Good morning, lovelies.
Anise, you didn't have to go through all this trouble.
I don't mind.
My stomach likes to harmonize with Rosemary's.
You're in luck then. Aloe's elbows deep in pancake batter. It's been ages since she cooked for family.
Does she need help?
Oh no, even I'm not allowed in that kitchen when she's got that look in her eye.
Being able to tell a story visually is so important, particularly for fantasy, where being able to establish ideas non-verbally alleviates from the dreaded exposition dump. But yeah, I've talked too much about the visuals and presentations now. It's a mixed bag. Obviously, on some level it's unfair to compare the two, but on others, even with all the resources in the world, I still don't know what the writers of Spice were attempting. So let's talk more specifically about one of the key components to storytelling that's more particular to fantasy: world building. Presumably in a fantasy, you're going to be including some sort of magical or supernatural elements that will be important to your story. And to make them feel more believable and natural in your narrative, you'll want them to be understood by your audience and interwoven into the very fabric of your character's surroundings, as opposed to feeling like cheap tricks that artificially move the plot from point A to B. In Arcane, the main fantasy element is Hextech, this magical equipment pioneered by two of the show's central characters. Even though Hextech doesn't exist at the start of the series, Arcane does an incredible job of making it quickly feel like an inseparable part of this world. Hextech is this exciting new technology which can revolutionize science, magic, and industry. We see the people and trade it can bring to Piltover, economically and culturally enriching the city. This technology becomes instantly adopted because it reinforces the leadership's preconceived notions of what Piltover is, the city of progress and equality, feeding their ego and smug sense of superiority. The ingenuity of Hextech and the opportunity it provides become a symbol synonymous with Piltover's sense of identity, with the good it creates allowing the city's leaders to turn a blind eye to those they neglect. So when Hextech becomes a potentially corrupting influence, it's difficult for the city to simply rid itself of something that's now an important part of their culture and economy. This is most obvious in Jace's storyline and how he becomes trapped by the very technology he created, but it has effects that ripple throughout every single character in the show. The magic of Hextech is intrinsically linked to both Arcane's setting and the stories it wants to tell through its characters. High Guardian Spice doesn't do that. It has magic, but rather than it being woven into its setting in any sort of interesting or meaningful way, instead it's simply used to push forward the plot in individual episodes. The most egregious example of this coming in the show's 10th, where the character Time wants to get a message to her dad about magical healing water, and in order to cast a spell to speak to him, she needs to summon a demon who will open up a portal through which they can communicate. This is 10 episodes in, and by now we've already seen spells that can open pocket dimensions, turn people into stone, and transform cats into rejected fur affinity posts. So the requirements for this spell, which is essentially the equivalent of a phone call, being the only one in the series that requires the user to summon a demon, feels a little bit inconsistent with the logic of the show. It's not a plot hole necessarily, but there's never any reason given as to why this spell in particular is so prohibitive. The only real inference we can make is that the lesson of this episode was that Time needs to learn to trust her friends and stop doing everything by herself. So in order to learn that lesson, she needs to face some peril as a result of her actions. Thus why this is the spell that requires a demon. Rather than developing the show's magic naturally as an extension of its setting, Spice's fantasy elements are simply used as a short-term excuse to push the narrative, regardless of the bigger picture, bypassing the part where they should be tying into the internal logic of its world. Another effect of not tying the themes of your story to its world building is that your setting won't be very memorable as a result. Lingoth is a very boring fantasy town which says nothing about its story or messages. It's just a perfectly circular, vaguely historical settlement with no flavour or details. None of its individual elements are bad, but to make them work they need to reflect something from its storytelling. Ba Sing Se from Avatar is also perfectly circular, which is an uninspired and unnatural shape for a city to be. But in that case, it's because the city is surrounded by a series of concentric walls isolating it from the outside world. Orth from Made in Abyss is a generic looking fantasy town, but those cutesy welcoming aesthetics, like the series itself, belie the dark violent horrors that lurk beneath. Kill la Kill's Hono City is another round settlement featuring a prestigious academy. The city reflects the uphill competition at the heart of Kill la Kill that allows students to rise up through the heavily stratified social classes, with no household being higher than Hanoji Academy itself, looming above the city in absolute domination. Lingoth fails to do any of these. This building at the top of the city isn't even the academy. We have no idea why that building is supposed to be important. The whole point of High Guardian Spice is that the girls are learning to be guardians and the conflict is about old magic versus new magic. So where are the statues to the famous old guardians whose epic tales inspire new generations? Where are the disused summoning circles of old magic practitioners that have since become forgotten to time and dilapidated? Where are the new amenities made possible by new magic that show the changing face of the city? These are the sort of details that a setting needs to tie itself to the story and become memorable. Again, Arcane does this excellently. The story's themes of social inequality are baked into the visuals of the setting. A perfect example coming in Arcane's first episode, where we get a feeling for Piltover and Zorn before we even know their names. Piltover is clean, opulent, inviting, inspiring, and polished. It is a city that prides itself as being a utopia and makes every effort to present itself as such, with its pristine, gleaming towers reaching up towards the heavens and never looking down to its undercity. In contrast, Zorn is clearly darker. Gone are the marble whites and sky blues, and instead the colour palette is green and brown, with most of the light coming from neon signs. It is a dingy and claustrophobic place, and you can almost feel the pressure of life there weighing down over everyone. Piltover and Zorn are instantly recognisable to an audience, clearly distinct and each one visually representing its role in the story. On top of that, you have how the setting is intertwined with its magic system, and once you've got that, you have a setting that is truly memorable. But let's take that even further by linking all this with the characters and their conflicts. In Arcane, we don't simply see the political situation between the two cities and how the presence of Hextech and Shimmer are exacerbating divisions, we also see the ripple effect that has on the characters at all levels of society. Rising crime, increasing police presence, growing corruption, and calls for independence. These symptoms of societal divide weed their way into the city and create barriers between the characters and their desires. Vi wants her sister back but finds herself falsely imprisoned and then isn't able to take on Silco without the help of a reluctant Piltover. Silco wants to liberate Zorn from Piltover's rule but has to contend with threats to his position and the unpredictability of Jinx's actions. Jinx also wants to reunite with Vi, but is plagued by her trust issues and deteriorating mental state as a result of her guilt, trauma, and Silco's isolating influence. Jace wants to improve lives with Hextech, but struggles first with the conservatism of Professor Dunder Mifflin.
No, God!
And then the corrupting nature of politics. All these restrictions on the character's goals are either directly or indirectly linked to the divides that drive the conflict of the story. You'd presume that High Guardian Spice would be aiming for something similar, but no. In Lingarth, characters might have wants and needs, but they're either A, not tied to the themes of the show, or B, the character's actions don't correlate to their goals. For example, Rose wants to emulate her lost mum and become an accomplished guardian. So she goes to the academy, which is fine because that's her role in the show. However, her true desires are to actually find her mum. That's what she's emotionally invested in, but her actions in the series don't advance that in any significant way. Sure, when she graduates, her training might further this plot, but over the course of this entire first season, her going to school is irrelevant to any actual narrative investment the audience is supposed to have in her, assuming that the show did a good job in setting that up. Rose being at the academy does nothing for her character for the entire season, which is why when the show needs to keep the plotline of finding her mum relevant, it does things like reintroduce Lavender as this generic badass 4 or 5 different times, reiterating the same points but without adding anything new. The main cast's arcs also have nothing specifically to do with the central conflict of old versus new magic. New magic, presumably causing the rot which is damaging the natural environment, does directly correlate to Time's motivation and, in a way, to Sage's story about learning to accept new spells, but it's not as though either of them have any particular attachment to new magic. If the conflict at the heart of your setting is people's conveniences resulting in ecological disaster, wouldn't it make more dramatic sense to have your main characters invested in those conveniences? Rose is a warrior, Parsley a blacksmith, Times an archer, and Sage uses old magic. Contrast this to Arcane, where half the main cast are economically, emotionally, or egotistically attached to Hextech. Yes, presumably Spice's side characters would be hesitant to give up new magic, such as Amaryllis or the potions teacher, which is weird considering she teaches an old magic class but dismisses it in favour of new magic, but whatever. But not your main characters, which is an odd choice to not set up any of your core quartet to have any reticence over what would have presumably been a key turning point in the series. So, because the actions of High Guardian's characters don't relate to their needs or the main conflict, the show has very little direction. Parsley's character development ends in the 4th episode, Rose and Sage get into a pointless spat for a while that has no real impact on anything. And we get things like episode 3, where the script feels like it was genuinely procedurally generated by a malfunctioning AI, cramming in an A, B, and C plot into a 22-minute episode. Featuring a buff feline that kickstarts Time's plot, even though the episode only really remembers she exists in its final 2 minutes, multiple flashbacks, and Parsley falling through a trapdoor into some catacombs that lead to a cavern full of glowing crabs that direct her to a hidden janitor's closet that leads to a crawl space that opens up back at the forge she began at, which proves that she has somehow mastered using small tools and is rewarded with a tiny mallet that never makes another appearance in the rest of the fucking series. there has been so much made about Caraway being trans in this episode, and that is, by some measure, the least interesting shit happening here.
You can't just have your characters announce
Their pronouns.
that makes me
They, them.
Honestly, there is so much I could go into, like how Arcane does all it can to avoid exposition, with its first episode focusing on the characters and their struggles, not once stopping the flow of the story to awkwardly explain the setting's history or politics or magic. Whereas High Guardian Spice isn't even able to spare a visual aid when it's doing something like explaining the difference between its two types of magic. Seriously, so much of this show is about old magic versus new magic, and Caraway can't even give us a visual demonstration of their differences. Or similarly when the show tries to explain what exactly the Guardian in High Guardian Spice means, and all we get is this long-winded list of incomprehensible vows and proclamations.
Listen here, children, to the true code of the Guardians. I swear by the power of the wind, trees, sea, and stone to protect and keep the land, holding it dear.
My multitude.
I promise all that came before me, and
my
those who come after I shall adding my wisdom of my curious cast upon the rules of my sword and question my cast I shall send my sword and those who come after adding my house. This I vow.
Can you repeat the part of the stuff where you said all about the things?
I don't know how a show can be this bad at educating its audience on its core concepts when it's set in a school of all places, but this is the same show that thinks it's okay to use PNGs from Google Images in the foreground of its shots. Some of you may have seen the last video I did on Smiling Friends. Smiling Friends also had a low budget. Smiling Friends also used stock imagery during a meal scene. Difference being that in Smiling Friends, it was supposed to be a joke? Or I could talk about how Spice's voice actors sound bored or disinterested half the time, with Slime Boy in particular giving the textbook performance of someone who only got the role because their uncle was a producer, which I've looked up and isn't even true, which makes this performance all the more baffling.
Hey, Slime Boy! Haven't seen you in a grog's age.
How's school?
Oh, it's fine. We're on break. We got catapulted out because of a trapper infestation.
Whereas in Arcane, the voice acting is pretty universally superb. And they even get Sheree Agdashlu, who has, hands down, one of the best voices on the planet.
You know this crossed the line upstairs.
Was anyone hurt?
A building was blown to bits. What do you think?
Those who did this will be dealt with.
That workshop belonged to the Kermans. You know what kind of stuff they had in there? Makes this place look like a candy shop. The council needs someone to make an example of. People need to feel safe.
Arcane makes great use of music to build up its tension and to make its setting feel more vibrant, whereas High Guardian Spice's theme is one of the most corny and saccharine songs you're likely to listen to, at least for the next 22 minutes until you hear its embarrassingly auto-tuned and somehow even worse outro music.
Friends for a lifetime, amazing adventures, finding who I am, you by my side, and then drinking hot cocoa, sharing our secrets, happy 'cause I'm with you.
Say goodbye to dirty stains and dirty surfaces with you, kids and gone.
Arcane gives its side characters their own motivations and worries and naturally develops a few of them to take their place alongside the main cast. Whereas High Guardian Spice's side characters are like Parnell, who is a disappointingly dated and harmful stereotype. I'm not entirely sure what of exactly, but if you do object to this depiction of whatever Parnell is supposed to represent, then you have my support. Or how Arcane has a consistent tone that steadily builds up intensity before exploding into these brilliant dramatic twists, whereas High Guardian Spice is ostensibly a show for little children, despite its warning at the start of every episode, until it suddenly decides to have characters stab animals in the face and start swearing.
Just trying out my new terrasphere, but I can't control it yet. You know how it is.
Not really. I don't mess with that shit.
There's too much for me to go into details for, but my point is that there's always more to fantasy than simply fairy castles and fire-breathing dragons. You're ultimately trying to tell a story, just in a setting of your own creation, and any fantasy elements that you introduce should ultimately be in service of that story. Yes, Arcane had a much bigger budget than High Guardian Spice, which does give it access to some more visually engaging forms of storytelling, but from what I can see from Spice's first season, even with all the resources in the world, it was never going to be good. And again, that doesn't mean I hate the show, because I don't. It's fun in its own sort of nauseating way. I wouldn't recommend it, it's not actually worth watching, but there is some sort of fascination of seeing something miss the fundamental basics, like linking your characters and their arcs to the magic and the setting around them. It's a story without direction or any semblance of what it wants to be. If there's anything to take away from High Guardian Spice, it's a lesson of what not to do when telling a fantasy story. The takeaway from Arcane is a lot more hopeful. That Western animated fantasy is finally establishing its own adult audience and identity. It's promising and hopefully means we'll get a lot more shows like Arcane in the future. And while I can't guarantee they'll all be quite as good as this, I do like to think that they won't be quite as bad as this. And God, I hope not this. Thanks for watching. I saw these two shows back to back, which is about as close as I ever want to come to experiencing Whiplash. If you want to see Arcane, which I highly recommend, you can catch that on Netflix. And if for whatever reason you do want to watch High Guardian Spice, that's on Crunchyroll. I'm also going to mention the Smiling Friends video and the immense reception that it got. It's at like 150 something thousand views at the moment, which is insane, and I'm over 1,000 subs now, which is all the motivation I need to just keep making stuff like this. So thanks to anyone who's watched or subscribed or commented, whatever. I'm gonna try and keep on making stuff like this, and fingers crossed someone out there will enjoy it. So until next time, thanks.